I got to ask, what is it like working on a presidential campaign?
I'd never done it before. And, it's probably something you should do in your 20s in terms of just the energy level. But it was incredible. I mean, and this is going to sound kind of a little utopian, but just to have the diversity that was on that campaign and overnight, like we grew from 20 to 200, in a matter of weeks, literally. And obviously Bloomberg had the resources to make that happen. But the physical plant kind of came to life before our eyes. We were in an open space, what they call the bullpen, in the old New York Times offices. No cubicles, no offices at all, although there were places you could go have a private meeting, but none of us had walls. So I was on the coalition's team sitting across from the Latinx person and next to the person in charge of African American outreach. And then right next to me was Asian American outreach. And the fact that we all had to kind of, make a village and make a campaign overnight and reflect someone that we believed in, but also be trying to chart a course that was, I think, a lot more centrist than has been the conversation. It was very powerful. It was very challenging. And, I would, again, recommend that if you ever get the opportunity, there's nothing like it. But you need a lot of coffee or Red Bull or whatever.
But what are the hours like? Like, what time did you show up in the morning? What time did you leave?
It's a great question because, as my husband would say, I never put my phone down. And I didn't realize that we would all be getting our own Bloomberg phone and Bloomberg laptop, which was basically, according to the law, you couldn't be sending, campaign emails or communication on non-campaign devices, which meant that I always had both in both hands, trying to kind of, when you're doing outreach, you basically, especially for Bloomberg, is all about data. You have to keep kind of proving how many Jews you're reaching if you're the director of Jewish outreach. So it wasn't just like, I kind of thought at the beginning, I'm just going to talk to a lot of Jews. You had to kind of quantify your outreach. And so there was a lot of also keeping track of those communications. But in terms of the hours, I kind of was never off duty. But I would basically, we had an 8:30 meeting, the coalition's team in the morning every day. I was certainly up at 6:30 already on email. And then I often didn't leave the office until 8 or 9. And then we were on the road, because obviously Jews are everywhere in the country. In particular, I was focused on the cities with the most of our population. You just had to kind of go nonstop to try to reach people, having house meetings, having kind of larger, almost rally-like meetings. So it was pretty much nonstop, but it was kind of ours to invent. Nobody said, Abby, this is how to do Jewish outreach. Go for it. They kind of were like, this is up to you.
Did it ever advance to a stage where people in the campaign were thinking about what positions they might want if he were to, become president?
You mean like if we got jobs in the new administration?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because, and maybe it is that Jews aren't optimists as much as we're passionate. It's could have never occurred to me that we would actually, I believe that he could win, but I never saw myself as part of that story. I felt like I had this job to do that I actually had never done before and was only doing because of the sui generis moment of the fact that I didn't feel like we'd ever been here before quite this way with this urgency. And frankly, I couldn't just stand idly by before. Journalists are supposed to be observers. So I was sort of making a decision not to be kind of anonymous anymore and not to be impartial. I was going to be very partial because I was screaming at CNN every day. And I felt, frankly, kind of moved as a Jew. I mean, it may sound mushy, but it was true. I mean, we all know that Pirkei Avot, it is not your obligation to complete the work, but neither can you desist from it. I felt like, Abby, you have to do the work here. You can't just rail at the condition of our country right now, or the condition of the rhetoric and the division, and particularly in the Jewish community. I feel like this president has not just divided Americans, but divided Jews and played to our fissures in a way that I think was really not just alarming, but damaging for a very small people.
Did you know Mike Bloomberg before the campaign? I mean, you're a well-known figure in New York.
Interestingly enough, I had met Mike Bloomberg when I interviewed him for a very short-lived publication called Brill's Content, which no one will remember, but it was actually a great magazine that covered the media. And it was unfortunate enough to start right before 9/11, and pretty much everything that had just begun sort of went belly up after 9/11. But for Brill's Content, I interviewed him about Bloomberg News, And so we had a very extended interview then. And so I spent a lot of time with him for that, and time with his colleagues and at his organization. But he wouldn't know me to bump into me on the street before I got this job.
So
I was brought in by someone.
How did they find you? Who reached out to you?
Yeah, someone who knows him very well knew me. And I think what they thought, I have due humility here because I'm not a campaign person and not sort of a Jewish professional in that way.
Sure.
What I think they appreciated about my kind of Jewish background journalistically is that part of what I've done is ask a lot of questions and give a lot of speeches to Jews all over the country. And in the process, that means I have a lot of connections with rabbis in every state, with JCCs, federations, right. Not-for-profits. You know, I have a lot of tentacles in, I think, more places than the average New York Jew, because I'm, first of all, interested in different takes on our tradition and our teaching, but also I know that the wisdom is everywhere. And I've been lucky enough to speak about my books at, so many people don't realize there's sort of a Jewish book circuit. Yeah. And when you're on it, you eat a lot of salmon at these luncheons and you get to speak for 20 minutes. So you meet a lot of Jews everywhere, which is really a privilege.
You know, I was watching, obviously the entire primary from here and almost involved in a couple of ways. You even reached out to me at some point to try to help out here on the ground in Israel with the Bloomberg campaign. And I had somewhat of a connection to Buttigieg, and so kind of a home. He was the mayor of South Bend where I grew up, and we still have some connections. So we had I was rooting for a couple of people here. But I got to ask, one of the things, you know, kind of watching as half an outsider, half an American, but who hasn't lived in the States for a long time, when Trump was coming into the campaign and then he came into office, I was really hoping, you know, for the sake of America and for the sake of the world, really, that part of his campaign line that said, look at me, I was a successful businessman, I'll get it done. Now, we know a lot of that's just not true. I mean, a lot of his claims to be a successful businessman turned out to be, you know, cons. Whereas Bloomberg really is a successful businessman on a much larger scale. And, you know, I was never a New York insider, but it seems to me he was also a pretty successful mayor of the most important city in the world. Why would someone who's so successful, both in government and in business, and who has this empire, and who's pushing what seemed to be a centrist line where most Americans really are in that centrist space, why do you think the campaign didn't take off? Why do you think it didn't catch fire? You know, of course, hindsight's 20/20, but, you know, as far as you can see now.
Well, first, it's a great question, and this is going to sound defensive, and I don't mean it to be. We were taking off. It was kind of amazing. Like, everything that had been laid out by Kevin Sheekey, the campaign director, in terms of the strategy, skipping the first 4 states, and, you know, making people in the country feel like they had a voice early on, because they have to wait for their primary and can't get involved until it's essentially their turn. All of that was playing out exactly as it was mapped out to be, and including those first 2 primaries, if you remember Iowa, New Hampshire. Yeah. It was going our way. And I will just say on the road, sorry, go ahead, Dan. You were going to, I'm going to let you speak since it's your podcast.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, Bloomberg got on the board. He was, he managed to get into the first debates. He was on the board.
Right. He was on the board. And more than that, when we were on the road, the response was quite extraordinary. And it was because, as much as people might have liked Biden, every poll said that he couldn't win. This was, again, pre-North Carolina, where the narrative was, we have to turn this around. We cannot have another 4 years, and we need someone who can win. Who's the winner here? And literally, the New York Times in November of this past fall did a poll at the same time that Bloomberg did a poll internally. And it came up with the same exact result, which is that with all of the candidates who are currently in the field, none of them were going to beat Donald Trump in the swing states that were going to decide the election. That's pretty decisive. And so there were plenty of observers and those who are engaged, particularly Jewishly, who said, you know, that's untenable. And here's a guy who has been, exactly as you said, unbelievably effective. He actually has a track record. Right. on all of the things that we care about, I think, as Jews, and we're certainly not monolithic, so we care about a lot of things, but particularly in terms of just the narrative of the spike in anti-Semitism, a defense of Israel that is robust and unflagging, and progressive values. I mean, Mike was out front on gun control, out front on climate, way ahead of people on that. Even women's rights, reproductive rights, kind of amazing. And equal opportunity for those who have not had fair education and healthcare and all of that. I think where we frankly began to falter was that debate stage. And that we just have to acknowledge that that was something that none of us anticipated would be as much of a hurdle as it was. I think we can dissect all day long what went wrong there, but that's when kind of the tectonic plate started to turn, and we had a harder story to tell.
Is it hard when you end a campaign? I mean, number one is it must be very hard when a campaign ends. Like all of a sudden there's all this energy and there's all this momentum, and then one day it's like, okay, we're turning the lights off,
packing up the office, taking down the banners, right?
But is it hard? I guess this is a two-part question. Is it hard? And then second, is it hard at that place to move on and back another candidate? And then back Joe Biden as that other candidate in this race?
These are great questions. And I don't say that to blow smoke, because both were entirely true. First, it was like leaving a family, that had kind of become a family overnight. And so it almost sounds kind of unrealistic how close we were, how fast, but it's such an intense crucible that you are just bonded, you're bonded in the unlikeliness of this enterprise. I mean, how many people said nobody's ever done it this way? Nobody's ever, kind of defied the blueprint the way that this campaign is, with the resources that this campaign has. And it was a really diverse, energized, kind of like, loving place. Like, we were working our butts off, but we were kind of, we were an army, and we were all believers. So the fact that literally overnight, you are, just as you described, taking those posters down. And frankly, we had to kind of get out fast, because there's all rules about, you can't kind of keep phones anymore. You have to figure out your laptops. You have to do your expenses. And, we had mishpucha for Mike, and Mike in Hebrew. And, we had these buttons and T-shirts and posters, and that's like an artifact now. I can sell those to you for a lot of money. In fact, they're really a collector's item.
Yeah.
But it's just sad, that all the swag and stuff, it was just sad. Like you're here and then it's over. Yeah. And then in terms of going right to the next guy or woman, but in this case, Biden, it wasn't just a natural thing, because you're again, faith is faith. And it's not that I don't believe in Joe, and particularly now, but this is pre-COVID, and you just feel like, your guy is now not in this, and you kind of have to get the energy up again to say, do I have this in me to do it all over again and to start all over again? And frankly, I don't think that a lot of us were called to join that team right away. So maybe if they had been sort of urging us to kind of keep going, but I don't think there was a lot of outreach, and I don't blame them. They had their own family. So
do they have a Jewish outreach figure?
They do now. And full disclosure, I did get some feelers out as to whether I would consider applying for the job. No one offered me the job, but a really great guy is doing it. I think they're doing it differently as well, because he's a different candidate. So it's different to be working for a Jewish candidate when you're doing Jewish outreach.
When you're looking at the slate of candidates back when it was a full field, okay, and let's put Bloomberg aside, let's put your personal connection aside. Who did you like the most as far as your own values, and then from a strategic standpoint, as far as taking on Trump, who did you think would be the most fitting? In the end, was it Biden, or was it one of the other candidates?
Pre-Mike, it was Buttigieg. And it's so interesting that you said that. I just kind of fell in love with the guy early on. I'd never heard anyone speak like that. And he's brilliant. He's brilliant. Yeah, it's not just his brilliance. It's also his thoughtfulness, the fact that he seemed to actually listen and consider before answering, the fact that his answers were not always the same, the fact that he had a kind of humility while also having a certain ambition. And so it wasn't just his story. I haven't heard somebody really be able to field any inquiry as deftly and as thoroughly. And maybe it's also just the antithesis of Trump. But having someone who reads and cares and learns and keeps learning and admits when he doesn't know, and admits, any kind of self-deprecation, it was all refreshing. And I had the luck of seeing him in person, and I listened to a bunch of his interviews also. And I just thought I've never seen someone like him. And so I think he had his own stumbles and his own hurdles. We all know what they are, but he was the one I felt like, in a way, could go the distance and shock everybody.
I had the pleasure when he was on his trip to Israel. This was before he announced. So I was asked to give him and a small group of mayors a private briefing on U.S.-Israel relations.
When was this?
This was right before they announced his interest. So the stage right before he ran.
So this is like end of 2018?
2018, I think it was. And so I got to sit with him for a couple hours and talk about U.S.-Israel relations in the Middle East. And, on Middle East, we were going toe to toe because he knows the Middle East. He was an intelligence officer. He spent time here. He speaks a little bit of the languages. And yeah, he was, like you just said, he was really thoughtful. I got a sense he was authentic. I got a sense he I'm sure like anyone running for office, he's rehearsing a little bit. He knows his points, but there was an authenticity there. A lot of us like to say kind of a Midwestern aw shucks authenticity that I think a lot of Americans can connect to.
Definitely.
And I was asked here on Israeli radio a few times about him. And I think that's, the combination of his intellect and his ambition, but with that humility that you talk about, that I'd really like to see where he goes. If Biden wins, I can see him in the UN. I can see him even as Secretary of State or something like that. And then who knows down the road, I think he could be, hopefully, I think he's the, right person to do something in America right now.
It's interesting stuff. It's funny when you just said about his, Midwestern aw shucks mentality in sales, and I'm in sales. There's like a phrase which is that Midwest works. New York people that works in New York. It doesn't work so well once that person's out, in Kansas City trying to sell. Midwest works anywhere.
Yeah, because it's real.
And he was that for in many ways. And yeah, we're not going to get to see that this time around.